In the spring of 1987, a man named Dale Pruitt drove his university-issued white pickup down a gravel county road in Harlan County, Nebraska, and stopped at the gate of an 80-acre truck farm that a neighbor had tipped him about. Dale had an M.S. in horticultural science from the University of Nebraska, a thermos of coffee on the seat beside him, and a clipboard with a printed site visit form. He was the cooperative extension horticulture specialist for 3 counties, and he had seen a great many things farmers had built along fence lines and at the edges of pastures that they had convinced themselves were useful structures. He had seen lean-tos of salvaged tin. He had seen cold frames assembled from storm windows and bale twine. He climbed out of the truck, walked to the fence, and looked at what Vernon Holst had been building for 3 years. He wrote 2 words on the site visit form. Then he drove away. 8 years later, in the spring of 1995, Vernon's nephew, Kurt, stood inside that same structure and read a purchase order aloud. It was from Marta Vondra at Midlands Cooperative Wholesale in Omaha. The number on it was $37,760. That was for 1 season of winter vegetables grown inside what Dale Pruitt had called, in 1987, a gravel pile with delusions. $37,760. The numbers sat in the air of the glass house for a long time. Kurt did not say anything, neither did Vernon. Outside, the late March light was still thin, but inside the glass panels it was already warm enough to grow tomatoes. Let me tell you how 11 years of broken glass became that number. Vernon Holst was 63 years old in 1995, which meant he had been farming the same 80 acres outside Alma, Nebraska, for almost 40 years. He was known for 2 things in Harlan County: his patience and his tomatoes. The patience had come first. The patience came first. The tomatoes came from the patience. His mother, Edna, had farmed the place before him, and before her, the ground had been broken by his grandfather in 1911. When Edna died in 1973, she left Vernon the farm, the equipment, and a canvas-covered composition book in which she had been recording germination dates, soil temperatures, transplant mortality, and yield notes since 1941. 2 generations of handwriting ran down those pages, pencil fading to pen, fading back to pencil, at the places where one ran out and the other had to be found. Vernon kept the ledger in the kitchen drawer and added his own entries in ballpoint. He grew vegetables for the regional wholesale market and a modest share of roadside stand business. He was not a large operation. He did not aspire to be a large operation. He had 80 acres, a paid-off John Deere row cultivator, a 1969 Ford flatbed, and a border collie named Chalk who went with him everywhere on the farm. A black and white dog with a white muzzle that made him look perpetually elderly even when he was young. The farm itself was not impressive by the county's measures. The house needed paint on the south face. The equipment shed had a roof patch that had been provisional since 1978 and had settled into permanence. The acreage was not flat, cash-grain ground. It rolled and dipped in the way that river-bottom farms roll and dip in the Republican River corridor, which meant it was harder to run row crops on than the plat maps of neighboring farms and made it poor collateral against any kind of expansion loan. Vernon had never asked for an expansion loan. He grew what the ground would let him grow, and he sold it where people were willing to pay for it, and he put what he made against the tax bill and the operating costs, and was left most years with a modest surplus that he kept in a savings account at the Alma branch of the county bank. He did not think of this as poverty. He thought of it as the correct scale for what he knew how to do well. The ledger was central to that calculation. Though Vernon would not have called it a ledger, He called it his mother's book. Edna Holst had started it in the spring of 1941, the year she took over the farm from her own father, who had been sick through the previous winter. Her first entry was a germination date for early cabbage, April 9th, soil temperature 48 degrees at 3 inches, outside air 34, seedbed location, south end of the kitchen garden against the cedar windbreak. 40 pages of similar entries followed across the next 32 years, covering every crop Edna grew on that ground, the things that worked and the things that did not, the years when the south-facing beds outperformed the flat ground by enough to matter, and the year 1954, when a late frost took everything in the flat beds but left the slope plantings untouched. That entry had a single underlined note beside it: slope held. Vernon had read the book in pieces over the years, the way you read a field manual that you understand you will never fully finish because the field is always adding new pages. He knew the 1959 entry about the storm window cold frames the way a man knows a useful sentence he once encountered and never forgot. He had not tried to act on it yet because the cold frames themselves had rotted out in the 1970s, and he had not had the material to replace them. Then the material came. In the fall of 1984, Continental Bottling opened a glass container processing facility 11 miles north of Alma. The plant crushed returned glass and sorted it back into cullet for remelting. The legal access easement that ran along Vernon's east fence line became, that winter, a dumping corridor. Trucks came twice a month and offloaded what the plant could not immediately process: crushed glass, green, brown, and clear, some of it still in recognizable bottleneck fragments. Most of it in palm-sized pieces and smaller, tumbled smooth enough by the crusher to have lost their sharp edges, but still unmistakably glass. Vernon called the plant. A facilities manager explained that the easement permitted material staging and temporary deposit. The county attorney confirmed it. There was nothing to be done. He stood at the fence the morning after the third truck came and looked at the glass in the frozen grass. Chalk sat beside his boot and watched the glass too, as though waiting for it to do something. It caught the low winter sun in 100 places at once. Vernon went to the barn and got a flat shovel. He did not move the glass to get rid of it. He moved it because he needed to understand how much he had. He shoveled it into a wheelbarrow and carried it to the south side of the barn, where a gentle natural slope ran down away from the foundation. He stacked the larger pieces against the foundation boards, glass leaning on glass, and the smaller pieces he set aside in a feed sack. He wore heavy leather work gloves and moved slowly and methodically, the way a man moves when he is doing something he knows will take longer than one morning. It took many mornings. The glass kept coming. By spring of 1985, he had collected, by his own rough measure, close to 2 tons of glass material from the first winter's deposits. He sorted it as he moved it. Whole pane-sized pieces that the crusher had somehow failed to break, he stacked against the barn wall like lumber. Palm-sized tumbled pieces too small for pane use, but still useful, as infill went into a separate pile. The fine cullet, smaller than a finger, he put into a feed sack and would eventually use to bed the floor of the structure and improve drainage. He lost 2 afternoons to cutting his hand through the glove, and 1 afternoon to discovering that a particular grade of crushed brown glass, when wet and frozen and then thawed, became as slippery as ice underfoot. He wore rubber-soled boots after that. By the following winter, more glass had come. By 1987, the year Dale Pruitt visited, the total was somewhere near 6 tons, sorted and stacked on the south face of the barn, in a system that made sense if you understood what you were looking at, and made no sense at all if you did not. What Dale wrote on his form was not entirely wrong if you were measuring the situation by its appearance. A pile of broken glass along a fence line, stacked against a barn foundation in some organizational scheme a visitor could not immediately decode, did not resemble a greenhouse. The angle-iron frame Vernon had begun bolting together along the south wall had not yet been enclosed. The panes Vernon had begun cutting from larger fragments and fitting into lead channel had not yet formed anything that held heat. Dale looked at the raw material in a raw state and wrote down what he saw. A gravel pile with delusions. He said it quietly to the 3 other extension workers with him on the tour, and 2 of them smiled. The third, a woman who had farmed sorghum before her extension appointment, did not. Let me tell you what Dale could not see from the fence, because the building was not yet complete, and because his training had taught him to evaluate structures by their materials rather than their mechanisms. Glass is a thermal battery. That is not poetry, that is physics. When sunlight strikes a glass pane, a portion of its energy is converted to heat at the glass surface itself, and the rest passes through and is absorbed by whatever material sits inside. Polycarbonate plastic, which by 1987 was the standard material for commercial greenhouse construction, transmits roughly the same amount of light as glass. The difference is in what happens to the heat those materials absorb. Polycarbonate holds almost no thermal mass. When the sun goes down, the heat a polycarbonate panel collected dissipates within minutes. The structure becomes cold as fast as the outside air does. This is why commercial polycarbonate greenhouses require supplemental heating through every Nebraska winter night from October through April. They are windows with heaters behind them. Glass is different. A properly set glass panel, 1/4 inch thick, has enough thermal mass to continue radiating stored heat for several hours after sunset. It is a slow release, not a fast one, but it is real and it is measurable. A structure made entirely of glass, set in sufficient density and volume, can buffer nighttime temperature drops in ways that no sheet of polycarbonate can. Vernon did not know the physics in those terms. What he knew was what Edna's ledger told him. The old storm window cold frames she had placed along the south foundation in the 1950s had kept seedlings alive in February without any supplemental heat source. She had noted it as a curiosity. She had noted the soil temperatures inside and outside and the dates of germination and the surprising earliness of it. 2 pages of careful observation, dated and annotated. Vernon had read those pages many times. What he was building against the south face of the barn was an attempt to scale that observation. If 2 old storm windows could buffer cold enough to germinate seeds in February, what could 200 panes of reclaimed glass do? The answer required a particular approach to setting the panes. Vernon spent 2 winters working it out, fitting glass into salvaged lead channel and bedding the channel in glazing compound. He set the panes at a 15-degree overlap, 1 row above the next, the way shingles are set on a roof, so that any condensation ran down and away rather than pooling at the seams. The compound did not crack as caulk would in cold cycles. The lead channel flexed. The seams held. He spent $40 on hinges in 1985, $75 on lead channel and glazing compound across 1986 and 1987, and $140 on the angle iron framing that formed the skeleton. The glass itself cost him nothing, because it arrived at his fence twice a month and kept arriving. There was one more element that Dale could not have known from the fence line, because it had nothing to do with materials and everything to do with the ground itself. Vernon's barn sat at the high point of a gentle swale. The south-facing slope descended away from the foundation at a grade of about 2 feet per 100. Cold air is dense and flows downhill on still nights. The glass house sat at the top of that slope. Cold air drained away from its floor naturally, at no energy cost, every night of the year. Vernon had not engineered that. He had been born on that ground, and he simply knew that the south end of the barn never frosted as early as the low spots in the garden. He built where the cold drained away. By the winter of 1988, the first sealed section was complete. 400 square feet of glass panel on an angle iron frame, south-facing, sealed with compound and lead channel, sitting on the natural slope above the swale. Vernon had used 83 panes of varying sizes cut from the larger accumulated pieces, fitting them into the lead channel the way a glazier fits window glass, except that no two panes were the same dimension, and the fitting had required weeks of patient cutting and trial with a glass cutter he had bought used from a building salvage yard in Holdrege. He put tomato seedlings in it in January of 1989. He planted 2 rows of brandywine and 1 row of a cherry variety his mother had called Harlan Red in the ledger, a variety with no commercial name that had been on the farm since at least the 1940s and possibly longer. He set the thermometer at 3 inches of soil depth and read it every morning at 6. On February 7th, 1989, the outside air temperature was 12 below zero. Vernon wore his heaviest coat to walk from the house to the glass house, and his breath came in long white plumes in the dark before dawn. He opened the door and stepped inside, and the difference in temperature was immediate and real. The thermometer at 3 inches read 61 degrees. No propane, no electric heat. 12 below zero outside, 61 degrees at the seedling root zone inside. Just glass and slope and a 2-page observation his mother had written in 1959. He told no one. There was no one he needed to tell. What he had was not a claim. It was a temperature reading. The temperature reading either meant something or it did not, and he would know which by watching what the seedlings did next. Roy Steck had the farm a half-mile east of Vernon's, and Roy was a practical man who read the trade publications and attended the extension meetings and understood that the market for winter transplant starts was growing. He was 58 in 1989, a decade older than Vernon had been when he started farming, and he had worked his land in corn and soybeans his whole career and was looking for a way to supplement the row crop income now that margins were getting thin. The Extension Service had put out a bulletin on season extension greenhouse production. Roy had read it twice and driven to Lincoln to attend a workshop. He had done everything a practical man was supposed to do. In the spring of 1989, Roy broke ground on a 4,800 square foot Venlo-style polycarbonate greenhouse, the Dutch engineering that had become the commercial greenhouse standard across the Midwest by the late 1980s. He financed it through farmers and merchants at 11.5% on a $62,000 note. The contractor finished it by November. Roy was running cucumber starts and pepper seedlings by January 1990, and he turned a real profit that first year. The panels gleamed. The climate control system held the interior temperature within 2 degrees of target. Dale Pruitt stopped by in February 1990 and told Roy it was one of the best managed small greenhouse operations he had seen at that size in the county. Vernon watched Roy's polycarbonate panels glinting in the winter sun from his kitchen window and felt no urgency to defend what he was building. Roy's house was a fine house. Roy was a careful, intelligent man who had made a careful, intelligent decision based on the best information available to him. The difference between what Roy had built and what Vernon was building was not a difference in intelligence or effort or intention. It was a difference in what each man was working from. Roy was working from the bulletin and the workshop and the contractor's spec sheet. Vernon was working from 40 years of walking the same 80 acres and a composition book his mother had kept since 1941. The difference would become apparent in time, and time alone would make it. The county fair in August of 1990 was where Dale chose to revisit the subject. He gave a presentation on modern greenhouse production methods to a room of about 60 farmers and extension workers, and at one point, illustrating the importance of proper structural materials, he mentioned a local example of what not to do. He did not use Vernon's name, but he did not need to. Half the room knew whose east fence line he was describing. A glass novelty, he called it. A sentimental attachment to salvage that no commercial producer would recognize as a growing structure. A few people laughed. Roy Steck was in the audience and did not laugh. He had seen Vernon's tomatoes. Vernon was not at the meeting. He had been in the glass house that afternoon, putting in a second section of framing. By November 1990, the structure was 800 square feet. By the end of 1991, 1,600. The February tomatoes that second year were red and heavy, and tasted the way tomatoes grown in February in Nebraska had no right to taste, which is to say that they tasted the way a July tomato tasted in a place where July was warm enough to mean something. Vernon sold that crop to a hotel restaurant in Grand Island and a grocery cooperative in Kearney. He set the price at $2.10 a pound. They paid it. He did not announce any of this. That is not the same thing as concealment. He simply grew tomatoes and sold tomatoes, the way his mother had grown and sold tomatoes, and kept his notes in the ledger. If you have ever been told that what you are doing makes no sense by someone with a credential and a clipboard, and you kept doing it anyway because you could see from your own observations that it was working, you may recognize something in what Vernon's mornings in the glass house felt like in those years. He was not defying Dale Pruitt. He was not building a case. He was simply attending to the system he understood and letting the system produce what it was going to produce. Most of the people who have done something like that never left a comment about it anywhere. They just kept going. Kurt Holst arrived in June of 1992 with a freshly minted agronomy degree from the University of Nebraska and a set of opinions that the university had carefully calibrated. He was 24, Vernon's sister's boy, and he had come to help on the farm for a season while he decided what to do next. He was a quiet young man and a careful one, and he had the kind of respect for his uncle that comes from having watched a person work steadily his whole life without complaint. He also had 3 semesters of greenhouse and controlled environment agriculture and knew what the current literature said about structure materials. He walked through the glass house on his first afternoon and stood in the middle of it and said, with the careful respect of someone who loves the person they are disagreeing with, that glass was not a building material by any standard definition, and that the liability if a panel came down on someone was considerable. And had Vernon spoken to anyone with a structural background about what he was doing? Vernon said he had not. Kurt nodded and went out, and Chalk followed him to the gate and back, which is what Chalk did with visitors he was uncertain about. That evening, Vernon set Edna's ledger on the kitchen table and left it open to the February germination records from 1959. He did not suggest Kurt read it. He just left it there and went to bed. Kurt read it for 2 hours, sitting under the hanging kitchen light with the pages pulled slightly toward him, the way people lean into something they have not expected to find useful. He read Edna's entry about the storm window cold frames 3 times. He read the temperature records. He read the germination dates and set them against what he knew from his coursework about the soil temperatures required for early tomato germination, which is 55 degrees at 3 inches as a threshold, 58 for consistent rates, 62 for optimal. He looked at what Edna had written in 1959. Soil temp inside 59 degrees Fahrenheit at 3 inches, outside 31 degrees Fahrenheit air, outside ground frozen solid at 4 inches. He looked at the germination date she had recorded. He sat with that for a while. The next morning he came to the glass house and asked how the lead channel worked. The summer of 1993 was the driest on record in Harlan County since 1936. The heat came in early June and did not relent until September. In that heat, polycarbonate panels expand. The coefficient of thermal expansion for polycarbonate is roughly 8 times that of glass, which means that on a 103-degree afternoon in July, a polycarbonate panel is moving significantly in its framing. The seals stretch. If the expansion is greater than the panel's framing allowance, the panel buckles. Roy Steck's greenhouse ran at 112 degrees inside on July 14th, and by August he had buckled panels on the east and south sides that were letting unconditioned air straight through. He paid $8,700 to have them replaced before the fall season. The winter before that, Roy's propane bill had run to $4,400 for the November to March period, against a normal year's bill of about $1,200. A rate increase at the propane co-op, plus a cold snap in January that pushed outside temperatures to -28, had run his heating costs 3 times the projection he had built into his loan repayment model. Roy was not a careless man. He had done exactly what Dale Pruitt and the trade publications and the cooperative extension had told him to do. He had built a modern structure with proper materials and proper financing, and he had trusted the model. The model had not accounted for the propane rate structure in 1993, and the model had not accounted for the fact that polycarbonate has a thermal expansion rate 8 times that of glass, because no one in his extension curriculum had thought those things were going to matter at the time horizon that mattered. By the fall of 1993, Roy was $13,100 into costs his original loan model had not anticipated. $4,400 in excess propane the previous winter. $8,700 in panel repairs that summer. He had a $62,000 note at 11.5% that was not getting smaller as fast as his model had projected. He had a greenhouse that worked, in the sense that it still produced cucumber and pepper starts when the climate system was running correctly, and the panels were intact. He also had a structure that had demonstrated in 2 consecutive seasons that it would punish the weather extremes that a Nebraska winter and a Nebraska summer were perfectly capable of producing. Vernon's glass house, on the other side of the fence line, had not needed a panel replacement in 5 winters. Its heating bill for the 1992 to 1993 winter was $12 in electricity for the 2 extension lamps Vernon kept on the seedling bench during the coldest nights as a precaution. $12 against $4,400. That difference was not in the news and not in any bulletin. It was visible only if you were standing in both structures with a pencil and a number in your head. Dale visited Vernon in the fall of 1993. He had heard about Roy's repairs. He was writing a piece for the Extension newsletter on greenhouse resilience, and he thought a follow-up to his 1987 site visit might be useful. He walked through the glass house, by then 2,000 square feet, and producing cherry tomatoes, specialty herbs, and February pepper starts. He stood with his clipboard and his coffee thermos, and he looked at the lead channel seams and the 15-degree pane overlap, and the way the cold air drained naturally down the slope away from the floor. He said slowly that it was not a greenhouse by any standard definition. The framing was not up to code, the pane thickness was inconsistent, and the absence of supplemental heat was a single cold snap away from catastrophe. Vernon said he had been running without supplemental heat for 5 winters. Dale wrote something on his clipboard. He did not say anything else for a while. Then he thanked Vernon for his time and drove back up the county road. The hard winter of 1993 to 1994 brought 2 weeks of temperatures below -15 in January. Roy Steck's repaired panels held, but his propane bill for those 2 weeks alone was $940. Vernon's glass house held 63 degrees on the coldest night. The soil thermometer Kurt checked every morning never dropped below 59. Marta Vondra came from Omaha in March of 1994. She was the senior produce buyer for Midland's Cooperative Wholesale, and she had been hearing things secondhand from the Grand Island Hotel and the Kearney Grocery. She arrived on a Tuesday morning in a gray sedan and walked through the glass house in a winter coat that still felt necessary to her. Though inside the structure, it was warm enough that she unbuttoned it within a minute. She picked up a cherry tomato from a cluster near the south wall, the deepest red, the way a cherry tomato looks in late August when everything is right. She held it for a moment. Then she put it in her mouth. She stood very still. She said, after a long pause, that these had been grown in February in Nebraska, and that she needed to know how. Vernon told her. It took about 20 minutes. He walked her from the south end of the structure to the north, showing the overlap of the panes, the angle of the slope below the floor, the way the condensation tracked down and away from the seams without pooling. He did not offer any general theory about the difference between glass and polycarbonate. He showed her what he had built and described what it did in the terms he used in the ledger: dates, temperatures, germination counts, pounds harvested per row. Marta Vondra listened with the kind of attention that buyers at her level have developed over years of understanding that the way a farmer explains a thing tells you almost as much as the thing itself. She asked 2 questions. The first was about the minimum overnight temperature the structure had held in the coldest January on record, which was 1979, and Vernon had to tell her that 1979 predated the glass house, but that his coldest recorded overnight in the structure was -18 outside and 58 degrees at 3 inches of soil in January 1994. The second question was about water. How did he irrigate in February without the supply lines freezing? Vernon showed her the buried line that ran from the well along the south foundation, below frost depth, with a drain valve at the low point so he could clear it in an hour if he needed to. It had never frozen. Marta stood for a moment at the south wall where the cherry tomatoes hung in clusters and looked at them without touching them. Then she looked at Vernon. She said she would be in touch. On the drive back to Omaha, she wrote the first version of what became the 1994 to 95 winter purchase agreement. She had been buying produce for the cooperative for 19 years, and she had a clear understanding of what February tomatoes cost at the wholesale distribution point and what a reliable winter supply from a single grower inside the region's transport radius was worth to her membership. The numbers she put in the draft were not charity. They were a correct reading of scarcity and quality. When Vernon's tomatoes arrived in Omaha in February, they went to member groceries and hotel kitchens at a price that covered Marta's margin and left her members asking when the next shipment was coming. The agreement arrived by mail in April. Vernon read it at the kitchen table with chalk at his feet, and Kurt across from him pretending to read the extension bulletin. The agreement specified volume and delivery dates, and a price of $2.80 per pound for the cherry tomatoes, $2.20 for the beefsteaks, and a premium rate for the specialty herbs. Kurt did the math on a yellow legal pad. He wrote the number down and then looked at it for a moment, and then wrote it again to confirm he had not made an error. The spring of 1995 was when Kurt read the final purchase order aloud. Not the agreement, but the settled number after the season had run its course, the actual invoice paid and receipted. The season had overperformed the agreement by a modest amount because Vernon had opened a third growing section in October, and the herb yields had come in above projection. Kurt read the number and then set the paper down on the table. $37,760. 3,200 square feet of glass greenhouse. $11.80 per square foot per season. The county average for polycarbonate greenhouse production that year was $4.20 per square foot. Vernon had nearly 3 times the revenue per square foot of the standard operation, built from material that had been dumped at his fence as waste, at a total construction cost of $340 in hardware. Nobody said anything for what felt like a long time. Outside, the March wind moved through the angle iron framing of the glass house, and the panels caught the light and threw it around the barnyard in small, quick pieces. Kurt put the paper down on the ledger where Edna's 1959 February germination notes were still visible at the bottom of the open page. Dale Pruitt called 2 weeks later. He said he had been thinking about the lead channel seam method since his fall 1993 visit, and he wanted to know if Vernon would be willing to let him bring a graduate student out to document the thermal mass behavior across a full winter cycle. He said it carefully and evenly, the way a man speaks when he is asking for something he previously declared unnecessary. He said he thought there might be something the Extension Service had missed in its standard greenhouse materials guidance. Vernon said that was fine. He said to come in November when the coldest readings started, so the student could see the differential from the beginning. Dale said thank you, and that was all. In the years that followed, 4 neighbors came to learn the panel setting method. Bettina Krause, who had a south-facing machine shed wall she had never put to use, put in 800 square feet of glass panels in the fall of 1996 and ran her first February crop of spinach and arugula the following winter. She drove to Vernon's farm in March of 1997 with a box of spinach and set it on the kitchen table without saying anything. Vernon looked at it and nodded. That was the extent of the conversation, and it was sufficient. The Mendenhall brothers from the north end of the county came in the spring of 1997 and spent 2 afternoons watching Kurt set panes and then went home and began collecting glass from a different source, a plate glass shop in Hastings that paid disposal fees for scrap and was glad to have someone who would take it away for nothing. They called Vernon twice with questions about seam compound and once about the slope drainage calculation, and he answered each question directly and briefly in the way he answered all questions, which was to give the precise number or method without ornamentation. Vernon helped them spec the framing and calculate the slope requirement. He charged them nothing. Continental Bottling closed its Harlan County processing facility in 1998. The trucks stopped coming to the fence line. By then, Vernon had accumulated, across 14 years of deposits, what the County Waste Management Office estimated at 14 tons of glass cullet and panel material, of which roughly 4 tons remained stacked along the barn foundation, seasoned and sorted by thickness and color, more than enough to expand the glass house to 4,500 square feet if Vernon chose to do so. He did not choose to do so. 4,500 square feet was more than he could attend to with the attention it deserved, and he had learned from his mother's ledger and from 40 years on that ground that the limits of a system are not its failures. They are its shape. Kurt took up the ledger in 1997, adding his own entries in the same ballpoint style Vernon used, temperatures and dates and germination records, and the occasional note on what the slope drainage did in a particular cold snap. He wrote in the margin next to Edna's 1959 February record that the method had been confirmed across 43 consecutive winter seasons on the same ground. He drew a small bracket connecting her entry to his most recent one. One piece of information running between two people across 5 decades. Vernon retired from the daily operations in 2001 and handed Kurt the farm and the glass house and the ledger. He kept walking the rows every morning because the rows were there, and Chalk's successor, a younger black and white dog Kurt had named Flint, went with him, just as Chalk had gone with him, as dogs do on farms where the walking never really stops. What the County Extension Service measured and what Vernon grew were two different kinds of thing for most of those years. The service measured structure type, material grade, approved code compliance, and supplemental energy inputs, and by all of those measures for most of a decade, Vernon had nothing. What he had was glass, slope, and the observation notes his mother had written in the cold of 1959. 2 pages in a canvas-covered book under a kitchen lamp. They were not a greenhouse by any standard definition. The thing about standard definitions, though, is this. They describe what most people have found useful to describe at the moment they agreed on the description. They are a kind of institutional memory. And institutional memory is accurate about most of what it has seen. Most of the time. Across most of the places it has looked. What it cannot account for is a particular slope in a particular county where cold air drains south off a particular barn foundation, combined with a particular volume of glass accumulating at a fence line for reasons entirely outside anyone's plan. Standard definitions are built from the middle of the distribution. They are calibrated for the averaged-out case. What Vernon had was not an averaged-out case. It was 80 specific acres that his family had been reading for 80 years. Dale Pruitt's graduate student spent 2 full winters in the glass house with a set of calibrated thermometers and a data logger. She wrote her master's thesis on passive thermal mass in reclaimed glass greenhouse construction. It was the first systematic documentation of the panel setting method, and it cited Edna Holst's germination ledger in its literature review. The Extension Service incorporated a section on thermal mass principles into its greenhouse guidance by 2001. The section did not mention Vernon by name, though Dale Pruitt sent a copy to the farm with a handwritten note that said he believed the documentation was long overdue. Vernon read the note at the kitchen table. He set it on the ledger and did not comment on it further. A piece of glass does not know it is waste. It knows in the way that material objects know things, which is to say through physics rather than intention, how to absorb heat during the day and release it slowly at night, how to transmit light at the same rate it always has, how to expand and contract at its own coefficient without buckling or pulling a seal. It does the same things at a fence line that it does in a window. The difference is only in whether anyone with patience enough to ask the right question is standing nearby. The ledger is still in the kitchen drawer at the farm. The glass house is still standing. In the evening, when the light comes from the west at a low angle, the panels pick it up and scatter it across the barnyard in small, bright pieces, amber and green and clear, the same way they did the first winter. Vernon stacked them against the foundation, with a flat shovel and a border collie watching from the gate, before anyone had thought to call them anything at all. That is what attention looks like, held long enough to become a building. What the trucks brought was refuse. What Vernon built was permanent. The only difference between the two was the direction of a patient man's gaze.